We've covered our introduction to the squatting pattern with bilateral stance, so you had 2 feet on the ground. Now I'm going to introduce some unilateral variations, so this is getting into the lunge family a little bit. I mentioned before we're using Dan John's categories. He doesn't necessarily do a heap of lunging, but I want to be quite comprehensive, so we're going to cover the field a little bit. I'm talking about what I use with my clients. Normally the one-legged stuff is really more for range of motion and for balance. I'm not going to load it up very heavy. The bilateral versions are better for that because you can really ground yourself well and you're less likely to tip over and kill yourself with 2 feet on the ground than 1. But these can still be really useful for developing strength and balance and flexibility. So the different movements that we'll go through are the step up. This is a basic one that I use in the warm up for everyone. The reverse lunge, the walking lunge, the split squat, the pistol, and also prowler pushing, which will really fall into our loaded carry category, but I'm going to show you guys how to push a prowler because I think of it as a useful way to get a lot of the benefits of one-legged work. We're also going to go through the Cossack Squat, which is a movement I introduced in the stretching video. And as a bonus in this video, we're going to do a little bit of work on a movement called the windmill, which strictly speaking isn't a unilateral leg exercise, but it falls into that category of leg things that don't quite fit squat and deadlift. We're also going to do a quick note on calf training, the ever neglected calf training we'll chuck in at the end. Working on some unilateral stuff, we have the step up. I'm going to drive through my front heel, ensuring I lift up through the arch. I'm going to lock out my knee. I'm not going to let it stay bent. I'm going to lock it out at the top and I'm going to lift my opposite knee. So there's a little bit of balance involved at the top, a little bit of flexibility work. I'm not allowing it to collapse in. That would be a very precarious position. Good way to tear ligaments. Now, eventually we'll condition our knees to be able to handle these positions, but for someone learning starting out, trying to keep everything aligned will be a good way of making sure that your hips are actually contributing the way they should be, your ankles are doing what they should be, so that your knees don't get a heap of stress that should be taken on by other joints. Once you're comfortable with a low step up, we can move on to a higher step up. Nice and tall, pausing at the top each time. Don't allow the ankle to collapse. I'm doing running arms. You don't need to follow with that. Anything you need to do to balance. You can also load it up in different ways if you'd like. I tend not to load step ups. I think of it as more of a balance move, a coordination move, a little bit of mobility. Now moving on to the reverse lunge. It's a little bit harder than the step up because it has a bit more of an eccentric component where you're lowering a bit more weight. Watch that you don't shoot into the quad too much. So you see my knee shot forward, that'll be a lot more quadricep and I wouldn't involve the hip as much. Also watch you don't turn it into a split squat with a step. So you can see that my back foot is traveling off the ground almost immediately. I don't pop up and then stand. Also watching that the hips don't pivot side to side. We want to keep them nice and level, so we're stabilizing with our glutes and our abs, not flopping around. Often when people have a sore back, it's because they've allowed it to flop, allowed their hips to flop side to side when they're doing things like step-ups, climbing staircases, going for a run, whatever they're doing. Here's an example of how you might load the reverse lunge. You can see I'm having a little bit more trouble there for the ankle. As it gets a little bit heavier, it's a bit harder to balance. You could also do it overhead, controlling and all the way up, pausing at the top. Whoa, lost balance. There you go, you see it's a challenge. Tap and back up. Beautiful. You could also load it with your hands at your sides. For all of our lunging variations, all of our one-legged variations, you could load it these few different ways. The overhead version is a good one for making sure your abs have to work hard, but it does require a bit of shoulder flexibility and might be a bit sketchy if you're not used to holding things overhead. So be careful with that. The walking lunge. Traveling forward as I step. This one, whoop, is a favorite of track and field guys. I let my front knee flex a bit much on that last rep. We want to make sure it's basically 90 degrees at the bottom. Here I go. With a bit more load. Again, you can load those the same as you did the reverse lunges. There's a few different variations. Whoop. Use a barbell. There we go. Lots of fun. Just so you can see from the front, we have the walking lunge. That's how it looks when it's coming at you. Terrifying image. I'm now demonstrating the split squat. So this is something I told you to avoid in the lunge before. We're keeping both feet on the ground. You can put your hands in different spots, doesn't matter too much. We control down and then press back up. So it's a squat with a staggered stance. This will limit how much load you can use because there's more of a stability requirement. You have to try and balance and not tip over. Woo! Nearly tipped over. Controlling down and accelerating up. We can do a version of this, whoop, with a bench. When you pick things up, try not to pick them up way out in front of you like that. That's not good lifting technique. For heavy weights anyway. For light benches, we can get away with it. So here we have, it's called a Bulgarian Split Squat. My back knee is just gently tapping the ground. I get a little bit of a quad and a hip flexor stretch. You could go up on your toes, but I prefer to have the toe pointed. It's a bit uncomfortable at first, but you'll adapt. Tapping the back knee, show you on the other leg. Try to keep my hips level, so I don't want my left hip to be way behind my right. I want to keep everything nice and tall. Don't want to flop to one side. Controlling down and up. Again, the hands can go wherever you like. Now we'll have a look at the pistol. So there's a lot to stabilize here. One foot's completely off the ground. I can hold on to my toes with my hand, or I can just leave my leg out in front. I'm going to control down, keeping the knee in line with the toes, and then drive back up again. If you have a bit of trouble keeping the other foot off the ground, you can always elevate the opposite foot. This one's quite a challenging one, guys. I wouldn't really recommend it as a rank novice, but it's a nice one to build up to. Obviously, quite a bit of range of motion. You can do them with weights overhead if you want to go really advanced, but that's the pistol, just for reference. I don't use a heap of those with my clients because it's generally a bit too challenging for most of the people I get. So the Cossack Squat, we've gone over this in the stretches at the start. There's a few different variations. You can push out to the side and come back towards either direction, or you can just go down and up towards the middle. You can alternate from side to side, keeping both feet on the ground. Slide the foot out. We can even play with weird variations where you try to string one leg behind. Have fun with it, but that's the sort of thing you build up to once you're comfortable with one-legged stuff. That's a bit more advanced. And the Prowler. I put the Prowler in the category of unilateral leg work because I think it's a useful way to get a lot of the benefits of unilateral leg work at the same time that we're getting some good cardio in as well. A bit of conditioning for our lungs and our heart. Don't do a million tiny crazy steps. Try to take long deliberate steps. I find it works better. You'll be able to use your glutes and your calves and your quads a bit more if you don't take a million tiny fast steps. Also, try to actually stabilize and push the thing straight. If you're flopping all over side to side or bouncing up and down as you push, you have a problem. You can take a lower grip of whatever handles you have available to you. That can change the stimulus a little bit. It's a bit harder on your abs. Close to the ground, you can take really long strides. I like that variation. You can also do a bent arm variation or a bent over variation for a bit more hamstring. Now we're going to practice windmills. You want to push your hips away from the side you're tipping towards and just add a slight bend in the side you're tipping towards, the knee of the side you're tipping towards. First, you want to get this movement with no weight. This will look a little bit like some kind of bent pose from yoga. A little bit like a side angle pose maybe. Try not to let your shoulder roll in. Try not to get the movement through your spine or your neck. We're really aiming to get most of it from the hips here. Getting length through the glutes. Good. Don't worry if you can't go all the way to the ground. You might just get part of the way. That's fine. It's more important that you keep your back straight and flat than that you get a huge range of motion on this. I've got pretty good range, but I've built up to that over time. I was definitely nowhere near here when I started. So if you can only get to there and you're stuck, that's totally fine. That might be where this movement goes for you. But as you get more comfortable, you can go down further. Make sure your belly button's facing towards the front and not towards the ground there. That'll be a different movement. I'm just showing with a kettlebell. It's the same deal. I like to look up at the top hand. If you look down at the bottom hand, there's a chance that you might slouch, but you can play with both. Making sure I push my hips away from my head. Next version, a bit harder variation. Just gripping that kettlebell. I'll talk more about that later. Pushing the hips away, and now you see I have to balance the kettlebell overhead. This is a bit like the finishing position from an old-timey strongman move called the bent press. I control down I might only get to there if I'm inflexible, that's okay. But if I'm flexible enough, I'll go down all the way. And that's a really good one for addressing the lateral chain, which doesn't get a lot of love from things like squats and deadlifts and lunges. This is a nice way to get some different angles. As with the Cossack squat, we're just trying to get the hips working in some different planes so that you're not just like a train that can only run on the train tracks and gets derailed if there's a bit of lateral pressure. All right, that's the windmill, guys, bit of bonus. Here's our last little, not quite squat, but still important accessory for the lower body, and that's calf work. When I say important, a lot of people do neglect calf work. It's not the end of the world if you do. It can be handy for conditioning. You can see I've demonstrated a few different foot positions there. All of those are fine. Bit of variety is okay. Adding a bit of range by going off a step will just give you a bit of a stretch. I'm pausing at the top of each of these just to give it a little bit more of a contraction. There's lots of different variations for training calves. You can do one-legged as well. I would recommend that you do actually train calves. They can be thrown in just in between sets for something else. Just to help you keep your feet strong and conditioned. They're an area that get neglected. People don't pay attention to much below the knee in the gym a lot of the time. And part of the reason for that is it's well addressed in life if you are actually playing sports, dancing, running, climbing, whatever, doing real activities outside of the gym. But there's some stuff we can do in the gym. Once you've got that basic conditioning, we can do things like skipping, which I'm demonstrating here with a very, very short rope. There's skipping like you would do out on a running track. We can also play with vertical jumps. You could jump up onto an object, maybe a box, or horizontal jumps, if you're that way inclined. We could also just practice things like yoga where we stand on one leg. You can play with some different variations where it's a bit harder to balance because you're moving around a bit differently, but only have one foot on the ground. A variation for the overhead press, where you just stand on one foot, would be a good example. You have to stabilize a bit more through the hip, so that's a challenge there. All of these would be good ways to train your calves.